Chapter 3. The In or In. Georgie Bassett was a boy set apart. Not only that, Georgie knew that he was a boy set apart. He would think about it for 10 or 20 minutes at a time, and he could not look at himself in a mirror and remain wholly without emotion. What that emotion was, he would have been unable to put into words. But it helped him to understand that there was a certain noble something about him that other boys did not possess. Georgie's mother had been the first to discover that Georgie was a boy set apart. In fact, Georgie did not know it until one day when he happened to overhear his mother telling two of his aunts about it. True, he had always understood that he was the best boy in town, and he intended to be a minister when he grew up, but he had never before comprehended the full extent of his sanctity, and, from that fraught moment onward, he had an almost theatrical sense of his set-apartness. Penrod Schofield and Sam Williams and the other boys of the neighborhood all were conscious that there was something different and spiritual about Georgie, and though this consciousness of theirs may have been a little obscure, it was nonetheless actual. That is to say, they knew that Georgie Bassett was a boy set apart, but they did not know that they knew it. Georgie's air and manner at all times demonstrated to them that the thing was so, and moreover, their mother's absorbed appreciation of Georgie's wonderfulness from the very fount of it, for Mrs. Bassett's conversation was of little else. Thus, the radiance of his character became the topic of envious parental comment during moments of strained patience in many homes, so that altogether the most remarkable fact to be stated of Georgie Bassett is that he escaped the consequences as long as he did. Strange as it may seem, no actual violence was done him, except upon the incidental occasion of a tar fight into which he was drawn by an obvious eccentricity on the part of destiny. Naturally, he was not popular with his comrades. In all games he was pushed aside and disregarded, being invariably the tail-ender in every pastime in which leaders chose sides. His counsels were slighted as worse than weightless, and all his opinions instantly hooted. Still, considering the circumstances fairly and thoughtfully, it is difficult to deny that his boy companions showed creditable moderation in their treatment of him. That is, they were moderate up to a certain date, and even then they did not directly attack him. There was nothing cold-blooded about it at all. The thing was forced upon them, and though they all felt pleased and uplifted while it was happening, they did not understand precisely why. Nothing could more clearly prove their innocence of heart than this very ignorance, and yet none of the grown people who later felt themselves concerned in the matter was able to look at it in that light. Now here was a characteristic working of those reactions that produce what is sometimes called the injustice of life, because the grown people were responsible for the whole affair and were really the guilty parties. It was from grown people that Georgie Bassett learned he was a boy set apart, and the effect upon him was what alienated his friends. Then these alienated friends were brought, by odious comparisons on the part of grown people, to a condition of mind wherein they suffered dumb annoyance, like a low fever, whenever they heard Georgie's name mentioned, while association with his actual person became every day more and more irritating. And yet, having laid this fuse and having kept it constantly glowing, the grown people expected nothing to happen to Georgie. The catastrophe befell as a consequence of Sam Williams deciding to have a shack in his backyard. Sam had somehow obtained a vasty piano box and a quantity of lumber, and summoning Penrod Schofield and the coloured brethren, Herman and Verman, he expounded to them his building plans and offered them shares and benefits in the institution he proposed to found. Acceptance was enthusiastic. Straightway the assembly became a union of carpenters all of one mind, and 10 days saw the shack not completed but comprehensible. Anybody could tell by that time that it was intended for a shack. There was a door on leather hinges. It drooped perhaps, but it was a door. There was a window, not a glass one, but at least it could be looked out of, as Sam said. There was a chimney made of stovepipe, though that was merely decorative, because the cooking was done out of doors in an underground furnace that the boys excavated. There were pictures pasted on the interior walls, and hanging from a nail, there was a crayon portrait of Sam's grandfather, which he had brought down from the attic quietly, though, as he said, it wasn't any use on earth up there. There were 2 lame chairs from Penrod's attic, and along one wall ran a low and feeble structure intended to serve as a bench or divan. This would come in handy, Sam said, if any of the party had to lay down or anything. And at a pinch, such as a meeting of the association, it would serve to seat all the members in a row, for coincidentally with the development of the shack, the builders became something more than partners. Later, no one could remember who first suggested the founding of a secret order or society as a measure of exclusiveness and to keep the shack sacred to members only. But it was an idea that presently began to be more absorbing and satisfactory than even the shack itself. The outward manifestations of it might have been observed in the increased solemnity and preoccupation of the Caucasian members and in a few ceremonial observances exposed to the public eye. As an instance of these latter, Mrs. Williams, happening to glance from a rearward window about 4 o'clock one afternoon, found her attention arrested by what seemed to be a flag-raising before the door of the shack. Sam and Herman and Verman stood in attitudes of rigid attention, shoulder to shoulder, while Penrod Schofield, facing them, was apparently delivering some sort of exhortation, which he read from a scribbled sheet of foolscap. Concluding this, he lifted from the ground a long and somewhat warped clothes prop, from one end of which hung a whitish flag or pennon bearing an inscription. Sam and Herman and Verman lifted their right hands, while Penrod placed the other end of the clothes prop in a hole in the ground, with the pennon fluttering high above the shack. He then raised his own right hand, and the 4 boys repeated something in concert. It was inaudible to Mrs. Williams, but she was able to make out the inscription upon the pennon. It consisted of the peculiar phrase "in or in," done in black paint upon a muslin ground, and consequently seeming to be in need of a blotter. It recurred to her mind later that evening when she happened to find herself alone with Sam in the library, and in merest idle curiosity she asked, "Sam, what does 'in or in' mean?" Sam, bending over an arithmetic, uncreased his brow till it became of a blank and marble smoothness. "Ma'am? What are those words on your flag?" Sam gave her a long, cold, mystic look, rose to his feet and left the room with emphasis and dignity. For a moment she was puzzled, but Sam's older brother was this year completing his education at a university, and Mrs. Williams was not altogether ignorant of the obligations of secrecy imposed upon some brotherhoods, so she was able to comprehend Sam's silent withdrawal, and instead of summoning him back for further questions, she waited until he was out of hearing, and then began to laugh. Sam's action was in obedience to one of the rules adopted, at his own suggestion, as a law of the order. Penrod advocated it warmly. From Margaret he had heard accounts of her friends in college, and thus had learned much that ought to be done. On the other hand, Herman subscribed to it with reluctance, expressing a decided opinion that if he and Verman were questioned upon the matter at home and adopted the line of conduct required by the new rule, it would be well for them to depart not only from the room in which the questioning took place, but from the house, and hurriedly at that. "And stay away," he concluded. Verman, being tongue-tied, not without advantage in this case, and surely an ideal qualification for membership, was not so apprehensive. He voted with Sam and Penrod, carrying the day. New rules were adopted at every meeting, though it cannot be said that all of them were practicable, for in addition to the information possessed by Sam and Penrod, Herman and Verman had many ideas of their own, founded upon remarks overheard at home. Both their parents belonged to secret orders, their father to the Independent Lodge, so stated by Herman, and their mother to the Order of White Doves. From these and other sources, Penrod found no difficulty in compiling material for what came to be known as the ritual, and it was the ritual he was reading to the members when Mrs. Williams happened to observe the ceremonial raising of the emblem of the order. The ritual contained the oath, a key to the secret language or code devised by Penrod for use in uncertain emergencies, and passwords for admission to the shack, also instructions for recognizing a brother member in the dark, and a rather alarming sketch of the things to be done during the initiation of a candidate. This last was employed for the benefit of Master Roderick Magsworth Bitts, Jr. on the Saturday following the flag raising. He presented himself in Sam's yard, not for initiation, indeed, having no previous knowledge of the society of the Inn or Inn, but for general purposes of sport and pastime. At first sight of the shack, he expressed anticipations of pleasure, adding some suggestions for improving the architectural effect. Being prevented, however, from entering and even from standing in the vicinity of the sacred building, he plaintively demanded an explanation, whereupon he was commanded to withdraw to the front yard for a time, and the members held meeting in the shack. Roddy was elected and consented to undergo the initiation. He was not the only new member that day. A short time after Roddy had been taken into the shack for the reading of the ritual and other ceremonies, little Maurice Levy entered the Williams Gate and strolled round to the backyard, looking for Sam. He was surprised and delighted to behold the promising shack, and like Roddy, entertained fair hopes for the future. The door of the shack was closed, a board covered the window, but a murmur of voices came from within. Maurice stole close and listened. Through a crack, he could see the flicker of a candle flame, and he heard the voice of Penrod Schofield. "Roddy Bitts, do you solemnly swear?" "Well, all right," said the voice of Roddy, somewhat breathless. "How many fingers you see before your eyes?" "Can't see any," Roddy returned. "How could I? With this thing over my eyes, and laying down on my stomach anyway." "Then the time has come," Penrod announced in solemn tones. "The time has come." Whack! Evidently a broad and flat implement was thereupon applied to Roddy. "Ow, Bew," complained the candidate. "No noise," said Penrod sternly, and added, "Roddy Bitts must now say the oath. Say exactly what I say, Roddy, and if you don't, well, you better, because you'll see. Now say I solemnly swear—" "I solemnly swear," Roddy said, "to keep the secrets—" "To keep the secrets," Roddy repeated. "To keep the secrets in infidelity and violate in sanctuary." "What?" Roddy naturally inquired. Whack! "Ow!" cried Roddy. "That's no fair." "You got to say just what I say," Penrod was heard informing him. "That's the ritual, and anyway, even if you do get it right, Vermin's got to hit you every now and then because that's part of the ritual too. Now go on and say it. I solemnly swear to keep the secrets in infidelity and violate and sanctuary." "I solemnly swear," Roddy began. But Maurice Levy was tired of being no party to such fascinating proceedings, and he began to hammer upon the door. "Sam! Sam Williams," he shouted. "Let me in there. I know lots about initiatin'. Let me in." The door was flung open, revealing Roddy Bitts, blindfolded and bound, lying face down upon the floor of the shack, but Maurice had only a fugitive glimpse of this pathetic figure before he too was recumbent. 4 boys flung themselves indignantly upon him and bore him to earth. "Hi!" he squealed. "What you doing? Haven't you got any sense?" And from within the shack, Roddy added his own protest. "Let me up, can't you?" he cried. "I got to see what's going on out there, haven't I? I guess I'm not going to lay here all day. What you think I'm made of?" "You hush up," Penrod commanded. "This is a nice business," he continued, deeply aggrieved. "What kind of initiation do you expect this is anyhow?" "Well, here's Maurice Levy gone and seen part of the secrets," said Sam, in a voice of equal plaintiveness. "Yes, and I bet he was listening out here too." "Let me up," begged Maurice, half stifled. "I didn't do any harm to your old secrets, did I? Anyways, I just as soon initiated myself. I ain't afraid, so if you initiate me, what difference will it make if I did hear a little?" Struck with this idea, which seemed reasonable, Penrod obtained silence from everyone except Roddy, and it was decided to allow Maurice to rise and retire to the front yard. The brother members then withdrew within the shack, elected Maurice to the fellowship, and completed the initiation of Mr. Bits. After that, Maurice was summoned and underwent the ordeal with fortitude, though the newest brother, still tingling with his own experiences, helped to make certain parts of the ritual unprecedentedly severe. Once endowed with full membership, Maurice and Roddy accepted the obligations and privileges of the order with enthusiasm. Both interested themselves immediately in improvements for the shack and made excursions to their homes to obtain materials. Roddy returned with a pair of lensless mother-of-pearl opera glasses, a contribution that led to the creation of a new office called the Warner. It was his duty to climb upon the back fence once every 15 minutes and search the horizon for intruders or anybody that hasn't got any business around here. This post proved so popular at first that it was found necessary to provide for rotation in office and to shorten the interval from 15 minutes to an indefinite but much briefer period, determined principally by argument between the incumbent and his successor. And Maurice Levy contributed a device so pleasant and so necessary to the prevention of interruption during meetings that Penrod and Sam wondered why they had not thought of it themselves long before. It consisted of about 25 feet of garden hose in fair condition. One end of it was introduced into the shack through a knothole, and the other was secured by wire round the faucet of hydrant in the stable. Thus, if members of the order were assailed by thirst during an important session or in the course of an initiation, it would not be necessary for them all to leave the shack. One could go, instead, and when he had turned on the water at the hydrant, the members in the shack could drink without leaving their places. It was discovered also that the section of hose could be used as a speaking tube, and though it did prove necessary to explain by shouting outside the tube what one had said into it, still there was a general feeling that it provided another means of secrecy and an additional safeguard against intrusion. It is true that during the half-hour immediately following the installation of this convenience, there was a little violence among the brothers concerning a question of policy. Sam, Roddy and Vermin especially, wished to use the tube to talk through, and Maurice, Penrod and Herman wished to use it to drink through. As a consequence of the success of the latter party, the shack became too damp for habitation until another day, and several members, as they went home at dusk, might easily have been mistaken for survivors of some marine catastrophe. Still, not every shack is equipped with running water, and exuberance befitted the occasion. Everybody agreed that the afternoon had been one of the most successful and important in many weeks. The order of the Inn or Inn was doing splendidly, and yet every brother felt in his heart that there was one thing that could spoil it. Against that fatality, all were united to protect themselves, the shack, the ritual, the opera glasses, and the water and speaking tube. Sam spoke not only for himself but for the entire order when he declared, in speeding the last parting guest, "Well, we got to stick to one thing, or we might as well quit. Georgie Bassett better not come poking around." "No, sir," said Penrod. Chapter 4. Georgie becomes a member, but Georgie did. It is difficult to imagine how cause and effect could be more closely and patently related. Inevitably, Georgie did come poking around. How was he to refrain when daily, up and down the neighborhood, The brothers strutted with mystic and important airs when they whispered together and uttered words of strange import in his presence. Thus did they defeat their own object. They desired to keep Georgie at a distance, yet they could not refrain from posing before him. They wished to impress upon him the fact that he was an outsider, and they but succeeded in rousing his desire to be an insider, a desire that soon became a determination. For few were the days until he not only knew of the shack, but had actually paid it a visit. That was upon a morning when the other boys were in school, Georgie having found himself indisposed until about 10 o'clock, when he was able to take nourishment and subsequently to interest himself in this rather private errand. He climbed the Williams Alley fence, and, having made a modest investigation of the exterior of the shack, which was padlocked, retired without having disturbed anything except his own peace of mind. His curiosity, merely piqued before, now became ravenous and painful. It was not allayed by the mystic manners of the members or by the unnecessary emphasis they laid upon their coldness toward himself. And when a committee informed him darkly that there were secret orders to prevent his coming within 116 feet, such was Penrod's arbitrary language, of the Williams yard, in any direction, Georgie could bear it no longer, but entered his own house, and, in burning words, laid the case before a woman higher up. Here the responsibility for things is directly traceable to grown people. Within that hour, Mrs. Bassett sat in Mrs. Williams's library to address her hostess upon the subject of Georgie's grievance. "Of course it isn't Sam's fault," she said, concluding her interpretation of the affair. "Georgie likes Sam and didn't blame him at all. No, we both felt that Sam would always be a polite, nice boy. Georgie used those very words, but Penrod seems to have a very bad influence. Georgie felt that Sam would want him to come and play in the shack if Penrod didn't make Sam do everything he wants. What hurt Georgie most is that it's Sam's shack, and he felt for another boy to come and tell him that he mustn't even go near it. Well, of course, it was very trying, and he's very much hurt with little Maurice Levy too. He said that he was sure that even Penrod would be glad to have him for a member of their little club if it weren't for Maurice, and I think he spoke of Roddy Bits too." The fact that the two remaining members were coloured was omitted from this discourse, which leads to the deduction that Georgie had not mentioned it. "Georgie said all the other boys liked him very much," Mrs. Bassett continued, "and that he felt it his duty to join the club, because most of them were so anxious to have him, and he is sure he would have a good influence over them. He really did speak of it in quite a touching way, Mrs. Williams. Of course, we mothers mustn't brag of our sons too much, but Georgie really isn't like other boys. He is so sensitive, you can't think how this little affair has hurt him, and I felt that it might even make him ill. You see, I had to respect his reason for wanting to join the club. And if I am his mother," she gave a deprecating little laugh, "I must say that it seems noble to want to join not really for his own sake, but for the good that he felt his influence would have over the other boys. Don't you think so, Mrs. Williams?" Mrs. Williams said that she did, indeed. And the result of this interview was another, which took place between Sam and his father that evening, for Mrs. Williams, after talking to Sam herself, felt that the matter needed a man to deal with it. The man did it man fashion. "You either invite Georgie Bassett to play in the shack all he wants to," the man said, "or the shack comes down. But take your choice. I'm not going to have neighborhood quarrels over such—" "But, Papa—" "That's enough. You said yourself you haven't anything against Georgie." "I said—" "You said you didn't like him, but you couldn't tell why. You couldn't state a single instance of bad behavior against him. You couldn't mention anything he ever did which wasn't what a gentleman should have done. It's no use, I tell you. Either you invite Georgie to play in the shack as much as he likes next Saturday, or the shack comes down." "But, Papa—" "I'm not going to talk any more about it. If you want the shack pulled down and hauled away, you and your friends continue to tantalize this inoffensive little boy the way you have been. If you want to keep it, be polite and invite him in." "But that's all I said." Sam was crushed. Next day he communicated the bitter substance of the edict to the other members, and gloom became unanimous. So serious an aspect did the affair present that it was felt necessary to call a special meeting of the order after school. The entire membership was in attendance. The door was closed, the window covered with a board, and the candle lighted. Then all of the brothers, except one, began to express their sorrowful apprehensions. The whole thing was spoiled, they agreed, if Georgie Bassett had to be taken in. On the other hand, if they didn't take him in, there wouldn't be anything left. The one brother who failed to express any opinion was little Vermin. He was otherwise occupied. Vermin had been the official paddler during the initiations of Roddy Bitts and Maurice Levy. His work had been conscientious, and it seemed to be taken by consent that he was to continue in office. An old shingle from the woodshed roof had been used for the exercise of his function in the cases of Roddy and Maurice, but this afternoon he had brought with him a new one that he had picked up somewhere. It was broader and thicker than the old one, and during the melancholy prophecies of his fellows he whittled the lesser end of it to the likeness of a handle. Thus engaged, he bore no appearance of despondency. On the contrary, his eyes, shining brightly in the candlelight, indicated that eager thoughts possessed him, while from time to time the sound of a chuckle issued from his simple African throat. Gradually, the other brothers began to notice his preoccupation, and one by one they fell silent, regarding him thoughtfully. Slowly the darkness of their countenances lifted a little. Something happier and brighter began to glimmer from each boyish face. All eyes remained fascinated upon Vermin. "Well, anyway," said Penrod, in a tone that was almost cheerful, "this is only Tuesday. We got pretty near all week to fix up the initiation for Saturday." And Saturday brought sunshine to make the occasion more tolerable for both the candidate and the society. Mrs. Williams, going to the window to watch Sam when he left the house after lunch, marked with pleasure that his look and manner were sprightly as he skipped down the walk to the front gate. There he paused and yodeled for a time. An answering yodel came presently. Penrod Schofield appeared, and by his side walked Georgie Bassett. Georgie was always neat, but Mrs. Williams noticed that he exhibited unusual gloss and polish today. As for his expression, it was a shade too complacent under the circumstances, though, for that matter, perfect tact avoids an air of triumph under any circumstances. Mrs. Williams was pleased to observe that Sam and Penrod betrayed no resentment whatever. They seemed to have accepted defeat in a good spirit and to be inclined to make the best of Georgie. Indeed, they appeared to be genuinely excited about him. It was evident that their cordiality was eager and wholehearted. The three boys conferred for a few moments. Then Sam disappeared round the house and returned, waving his hand and nodding. Upon that, Penrod took Georgie's left arm, Sam took his right, and the three marched off to the backyard in a companionable way that made Mrs. Williams feel it had been an excellent thing to interfere a little in Georgie's interest. Experiencing the benevolent warmth that comes of assisting in a good action, she ascended to an apartment upstairs and for a couple of hours employed herself with needle and thread in sartorial repairs on behalf of her husband and Sam. Then she was interrupted by the advent of a coloured serving-maid. "Miss Williams, I reckon the house goin' fall down," this pessimist said, arriving out of breath. "That's a iety o' missed Sam's suddenly trying to pull the roof down on our haids." "The roof?" Mrs. Williams inquired mildly. "They aren't in the attic, are they?" "No'm. They in the cellar, but they reachin' for the roof. I never did hear no sech a rumpus and squawking and squalling and falling and whooping and whacking and banging. They troop down by the outside cellar do, nin, bang. They bust loose and been going on ever since, wuss'n bedlun. If they anything down cellar ain't broke by this time, it can't be only Jez the Foundersham, and I bet that ain't going to stand much longer. I'd gone down and stop 'em, but I'm afraid to. Hone, says Miss Williams, I'm afraid of my life go down there. All that bedlin going on. I thought I'd come see what you say. Mrs. Williams laughed. We have to stand a little noise in the house sometimes, Fanny, when there are boys. They're just playing, and a lot of noise is usually a pretty safe sign. Yes'm, Fanny said. It's yo house, Miss Williams, not mine. You want 'em tear it down, I'm willing. She departed, and Mrs. Williams continued to sew. The days were growing short, and at 5 o'clock she was obliged to put the work aside, as her eyes did not permit her to continue it by artificial light. Descending to the lower floor, she found the house silent, and when she opened the front door to see if the evening paper had come, she beheld Sam, Penrod, and Maurice Levy standing near the gate, engaged in quiet conversation. Penrod and Maurice departed while she was looking for the paper, and Sam came thoughtfully up the walk. Well, Sam, she said, it wasn't such a bad thing after all to show a little politeness to Georgie Bassett, was it? Sam gave her a non-committal look. Expression of every kind had been wiped from his countenance. He presented a blank surface. "No'm," he said meekly. "Everything was just a little pleasanter because you'd been friendly, wasn't it?" "Yes'm." "Has Georgie gone home?" "Yes'm." "I hear you made enough noise in the cellar. Did Georgie have a good time?" "Ma'am." "Did Georgie Bassett have a good time?" "Well," Sam now had the air of a person trying to remember details with absolute accuracy. "Well, he didn't say he did, and he didn't say he didn't." "Didn't he thank the boys?" "No'm." "Didn't he even thank you?" "No'm." "Why, that's queer," she said. "He's always so polite. He seemed to be having a good time, didn't he, Sam?" "Ma'am?" "Didn't Georgie seem to be enjoying himself?" This question, apparently so simple, was not answered with promptness. Sam looked at his mother in a puzzled way, and then he found it necessary to rub each of his shins in turn with the palm of his right hand. "I stumbled," he said apologetically. "I stumbled on the cellar steps." "Did you hurt yourself?" she asked quickly. "No, but I guess maybe I better rub some arnica." "I'll get it," she said. "Come up to your father's bathroom, Sam. Does it hurt much?" "No," he answered truthfully. "It hardly hurts at all." And having followed her to the bathroom, he insisted, with unusual gentleness, that he be left to apply the arnica to the alleged injuries himself. He was so persuasive that she yielded and descended to the library, where she found her husband once more at home after his day's work. "Well," he said, "did Georgie show up, and were they decent to him?" "Oh, yes, it's all right. Sam and Penrod were good as gold. I saw them being actually cordial to him." "That's well," Mr. Williams said, settling into a chair with his paper. "I was a little apprehensive, but I suppose I was mistaken. I walked home, and just now, as I passed Mrs. Bassett's, I saw Dr. Venny's car in front, and that barber from the corner shop on 2nd Street was going in the door. I couldn't think what a widow would need a barber and a doctor for, especially at the same time. I couldn't think what Georgie'd need such a combination for either, and then I got afraid that maybe—" Mrs. Williams laughed. "Oh, no, it hasn't anything to do with his having been over here. I'm sure they were very nice to him." "Well, I'm glad of that." "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Williams began, when Fanny appeared, summoning her to the telephone. It is pathetically true that Mrs. Williams went to the telephone humming a little song. She was detained at the instrument not more than 5 minutes. Then she made a plunging return into the library, a blanched and stricken woman. She made strange, sinister gestures at her husband. He sprang up, miserably prophetic. "Mrs. Bassett?" "Go to the telephone," Mrs. Williams said hoarsely. "She wants to talk to you too. She can't talk much. She's hysterical. She says they lured Georgie into the cellar and had him beaten. That's not all." Mr. Williams was already on his way. "You find Sam," he commanded over his shoulder. Mrs. Williams stepped into the front hall. "Sam!" she called, addressing the upper reaches of the stairway. "Sam!" Not even echo answered. "Sam!" A faint clearing of somebody's throat was heard behind her, a sound so modest and unobtrusive it was no more than just audible, and turning, the mother beheld her son sitting upon the floor in the shadow of the stairs and gazing meditatively at the hat-rack. His manner indicated that he wished to produce the impression that he had been sitting there, in this somewhat unusual place and occupation, for a considerable time, but without overhearing anything that went on in the library so close by. "Sam," she cried, "what have you done?" "Well, I guess my legs are all right," he said gently. "I got the arnica on, so probably they won't hurt any. Stand up," she said. "Ma'am, march into the library." Sam marched. Slow time. In fact, no funeral march has been composed in a time so slow as to suit this march of Sam's. One might have suspected that he was in a state of apprehension. Mr. Williams entered at one door as his son crossed the threshold of the other, and this encounter was a piteous sight. After one glance at his father's face, Sam turned desperately, as if to flee outright. But Mrs. Williams stood in the doorway behind him. "You come here!" And the father's voice was as terrible as his face. "What did you do to Georgie Bassett?" "Nothing," Sam gulped. "Nothing at all." "What?" We just initiated him." Mr. Williams turned abruptly, walked to the fireplace, and there turned again, facing the wretched Sam. "That's all you did?" "Yes, sir." "Georgie Bassett's mother has just told me over the telephone," Mr. Williams said deliberately, "that you and Penrod Schofield and Roderick Bitts and Maurice Levy lured Georgie into the cellar and had him beaten." At this, Sam was able to hold up his head a little and to summon a rather feeble indignation. "It ain't so," he declared. "We didn't any such thing lower him into the cellar. We weren't going near the cellar with him. We never thought of going down cellar. He went down there himself first." "So, I suppose he was running away from you, poor thing. Trying to escape from you, wasn't he?" "He wasn't," Sam said doggedly. "We weren't chasing him or anything at all." "Then why did he go in the cellar?" "Well, he didn't exactly go in the cellar," Sam said reluctantly. "Well, how did he get in the cellar then?" He fell in," said Sam. "How did he fall in?" No. "Well, the door was open, and, well, he kept walking around there, and we hollered at him to keep away, but just then he kind of, well, the first I noticed was I couldn't see him, and so we went and looked down the steps, and he was sitting down there on the bottom step and kind of shouting and—" "See here," Mr. Williams interrupted. "You're going to make a clean breast of this whole affair and take the consequences. You're going to tell it, and tell it all. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir." "Then you tell me how Georgie Bassett fell down the cellar steps, and tell me quick." He was blindfolded." "Aha! Now we're getting at it. You begin at the beginning and tell me just what you did to him from the time he got here. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Go on, then." "Well, I'm going to," Sam protested. "We never hurt him at all. He wasn't even hurt when he fell down cellar. There's a lot of mud down there because the cellar door leaks and—" "Sam!" Mr. Williams's tone was deadly. "Did you hear me tell you to begin at the beginning?" Sam made a great effort and was able to obey. "Well, we had everything ready for the initiation before lunch," he said. "We wanted it all to be nice because you said we had to have him, Papa, and after lunch Penrod went to guard him. That's a new part in the ritual. And he brought him over, and we took him out to the shack and blindfolded him, and, well, he got kind of mad because we wanted him to lay down on his stomach and be tied up. And he said he wouldn't, because the floor was a little bit wet in there, and he could feel it sort of squashy under his shoes. And he said his mother didn't want him ever to get dirty, and he just wouldn't do it. And we all kept telling him he had to, or else how could there be any initiation? And he kept getting madder and said he wanted to have the initiation outdoors where it wasn't wet, and he wasn't going to lay down on his stomach anyway. Sam paused for wind, then got underway again. Well, some of the boys were trying to get him to lay down on his stomach, and he kind of fell up against the door, and it came open, and he ran out in the yard. He was trying to get the blindfold off his eyes, but he couldn't, because it was a towel in a pretty hard knot. And he went tearing all around the backyard, and we didn't chase him or anything. All we did was just watch him. And that's when he fell in the cellar. Well, it didn't hurt him any. It didn't hurt him at all. But he was muddier than what he would have been if he'd just had sense enough to lay down in the shack. Well, so we thought, long as he was down in the cellar anyway, we might as well have the rest of the initiation down there. So we brought the things down and initiated him, and that's all. That's every bit we did to him. Yes, Mr. Williams said sardonically. I see. What were the details of the initiation? Sir? I want to know what else you did to him. What was the initiation? It's secret, Sam murmured piteously. Not any longer, I assure you. The society is a thing of the past, and you'll find your friend Penrod's parents agree with me in that. Mrs. Bassett had already telephoned them when she called us up. You go on with your story. Sam sighed deeply, and yet it may have been a consolation to know that his present misery was not altogether without its counterpart. Through the falling dusk, his spirit may have crossed the intervening distance to catch a glimpse of his friend suffering simultaneously and standing within the same peril. And if Sam's spirit did thus behold Penrod in jeopardy, it was a true vision. Go on, Mr. Williams said. Well, there wasn't any fire in the furnace because it's too warm yet, and we weren't going to do anything that hurt him, so we put him in there. In the furnace? It was cold, Sam protested. There hadn't been any fire there since last spring. Of course we told him there was fire in it. We had to do that, he continued earnestly, because that was part of the initiation. We only kept him in it a little while and kind of hammered on the outside a little, and then we took him out and got him to lay down on his stomach. Because he was all muddy anyway, where he fell down the cellar. And how could it matter to anybody that had any sense at all? Well, then we had the ritual, and why, the teeny little paddling he got wouldn't hurt a flea. Well, and then things were kind of spoiled anyway, so we didn't do but just a little more, and that's all. Go on. What was there just a little more? Well, we got him to swallow a little teeny bit of acidity that Penrod used to have to wear in a bag around his neck. It wasn't enough to even make a person sneeze. It wasn't much more than half a spoonful. It wasn't hardly a quarter of a spoonful. Ha, said Mr. Williams. That accounts for the doctor. What else? Well, we had some paint left over from our flag, and we put just a little teeny bit of it on his hair and— Ha, said Mr. Williams. That accounts for the barber. What else? That's all, Sam said, swallowing. Then he got mad and went home. Mr. Williams walked to the door and sternly motioned to the culprit to precede him through it. But just before the pair passed from her sight, Mrs. Williams gave way to an uncontrollable impulse. Sam, she asked, what does in or in stand for? The unfortunate boy had begun to sniffle. It means Inopinant Order of Infidelity, he moaned, and plodded onward to his doom. Not his alone. At that very moment, Master Roderick Magsworth Bitts, Jr. was suffering also, consequent upon telephoning on the part of Mrs. Bassett, though Roderick's punishment was administered less on the ground of Georgie's troubles and more on that of Roddy's having affiliated with an order consisting so largely of Herman and Vermin. As for Maurice Levy, he was no whit less unhappy. He fared as ill. Simultaneously, two ex-members of the Inn or Inn were finding their lot fortunate. Something had prompted them to linger in the alley in the vicinity of the shack, and it was to this fated edifice that Mr. Williams, with demoniac justice, brought Sam for the deed he had in mind. Herman and Vermin listened, awe-stricken, to what went on within the shack. Then, before it was over, they crept away and down the alley toward their own home. This was directly across the alley from the Schofield stable, and they were horrified at the sounds that issued from the interior of the stable storeroom. It was the St. Bartholomew's Eve of that neighborhood. "Man, said Herman, shaking his head. "Glad I ain't no white boy." Vermin seemed gloomily to assent.